The silence that envelopes me now is not merely an absence of sound, but a palpable, living entity, a cathedral I have built with my own two hands, stone by heavy stone, each one quarried from the deep, unforgiving bedrock of my own sorrow, each one polished smooth by the relentless river of my tears. This sanctuary of stillness stands as a testament to a war I never thought I could win, a peace I never believed I deserved. It is a hallowed space, consecrated by sacrifice and sanctified by survival, where the very air seems to vibrate with a hard-won peace, a frequency so pure and resonant it feels less like a sound and more like a divine presence, a hum at the very core of creation that harmonizes with the newly stilled rhythm of my own heart. This profound, majestic quiet is the absolute, beautiful antithesis to the decades of noise that once defined my existence, a roaring, chaotic symphony of struggle that scored the first 60 years of my life, a cacophony so all-consuming, so brutally efficient in its erasure, that it nearly succeeded in obliterating the woman I was, burying her deep beneath the crushing, suffocating roles of mother, provider, and martyr. The memory of that noise is not just a recollection, it is a phantom limb of sound, an echo etched into the very fossil record of my bones, a permanent record of a life spent in service to a love that ultimately declared me obsolete. I can still feel it, that noise, as if it were a physical entity sharing this room with me, the relentless, grinding, soul-scouring clamor of the industrial floor polishers in the hollow, cavernous office buildings at 2 a.m., a sound that was less an auditory experience and more a physical violation, a brutal vibration that began in the worn, paper-thin soles of my cheap work shoes and traveled up through the protesting bones of my legs and spine, a seismic shock of drudgery that settled into the very marrow of my being as a metallic, mind-numbing roar, a sound that drowned out all thought, all hope, all individuality, leaving behind only a numb, mechanical endurance, a state of being where the soul retreats to a tiny, locked room deep within and the body simply continues its programmed, desperate motions, an automaton of necessity fueled by fear and ferocious love. The smell, too, was a constant, unwelcome companion, a ghost that haunted my every waking and sleeping moment, the acrid, chemical tang of artificial lemon and ammonia, a pungent, toxic cocktail that would cling to my skin, my hair, the very fibers of my uniform, a scent that seeped into my pores and became the base note of my identity, an olfactory souvenir from the land of other people's prosperity that served as a constant, humiliating reminder of the grime I was paid to erase but which felt, in those dark, lonely hours, like it was becoming a permanent part of me, a stain on my very spirit that no amount of soap or scalding water could ever hope to wash away. I recall, with a clarity that still has the power to steal my breath, the frantic, hopeful, terrifying sound of my own heart pounding a wild, syncopated, desperate rhythm against my ribs as I signed away my financial security, my past, and my future, on a dotted line that seemed to blur and waver before my tear-filled eyes, the scratch of the pen a tiny, insignificant, pathetic sound against the roaring, terrifying waterfall of risk I was embracing, a sound that was instantly swallowed by the vast, quiet, suffocating fear that filled my small, modest living room, a fear so palpable I could taste it, coppery and sharp, on my tongue, a metallic flavor of impending doom that made my stomach clench and my hands tremble so violently I could barely form the letters of my own name. And I will never, ever forget the deafening, all-consuming, beautiful, terrifying roar of a love so intense, so absolute, it nearly erased my own identity, first for a man, Enoch, with his easy, infectious laugh that could light up a room and his restless, wandering hands that could never quite settle, not on a job, not on a dream, not on me, a man who vanished like a ghost one ordinary Tuesday, leaving behind a sonic boom of silence in his wake that was louder and more devastating than any argument could ever be, and then for my son, Lysander, a love that was a beautiful, terrifying, constant, glorious noise of worry, hope, sacrifice, and ferocious devotion, a cacophony that filled every empty space, every quiet moment in my life until there was no room left for Odessa, only for Mama, a role I played with every ounce of my soul, a part one inhabited so completely, so utterly, that I forgot where the character ended and the woman began, my own desires and dreams fading like old photographs left too long in the sun, their colors bleaching out in the bright, demanding, all-consuming light of his needs. This hard-won tranquility, here in my sun-drenched conservatory where the very air seems gilded, thick and sweet with the loamy, life-affirming scent of damp earth and the intoxicating, almost sinful perfume of night-blooming jasmine, is the physical and spiritual manifestation of a peace excavated from the very bedrock of betrayal, a peace mined from the deepest, Darkest quarries of heartbreak and refined in the crucible of a pain so profound, so total, it threatened to unmoor me from reality itself, to dissolve the very bonds of memory and hope that tethered me to who I thought I was, leaving me adrift in the starless, soundless, infinite void of my own perceived irrelevance. This room, with its arching glass ceiling that frames the ever-changing theater of the sky and its collection of thriving, demanding, exquisite orchids that I tend to with a patient, nurturing hand, is a world away from the chemical tang of cleaning solutions and the stale, recycled air of my old rented apartment. It is a covenant I have made with myself, a sacred space where I am no longer Mama, the martyr, or Odessa, the victim, but simply Odessa, the woman, whole and complete in her own solitude, a sovereign entity in her own right, answerable to no one, indebted to no dream but her own. The only sounds now are the gentle, whispered rustle of the fiddle-leaf fig's broad, waxy leaves turning toward the sun like devout worshippers following their silent, daily liturgy, the soft, percussive, reassuring click of the ancient grandfather clock in the hall, marking a time that is now wholly and blessedly my own, each measured tick a beat in a new, serene composition of contentment I am finally writing for myself, and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the world continuing its indifferent, majestic turn, a sound that once made me feel small and insignificant, a mere speck on its relentless wheel, but now reminds me of my own quiet, steadfast place within its vast, turning majesty, a single, harmonious note in a grand, cosmic symphony. This piece was not found, it was forged, hammered out on the anvil of a pain so profound it threatened to unmoor me from reality itself, and I had to learn, plank by painful plank, to build a new ship from the waterlogged wreckage of the old, a vessel sturdy enough to carry me across this sea of stillness, a journey I undertake each day with a gratitude that is as deep and as vast as the wounds that preceded it. This journey toward silence, toward this majestic, earned stillness, began not with a dramatic, tear-streaked confrontation or a fiery, final farewell, but with the sterile, polite, and utterly mundane chime of a smartphone, a sound that has become the modern herald of both connection and catastrophe, a digital bell tolling equally for joy and for despair, its generic, soulless tone indistinguishable, its meaning entirely dependent on the words that followed, a tiny, sleek oracle of doom I held in the palm of my hand, a Pandora's box disguised as a communication device, a portal to hell masquerading as a tool for connection. It was a Tuesday, I believe, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days had begun to bleed into one another in the gray, featureless, emotionally barren landscape of my rented apartment, a space that felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for a life that had been indefinitely postponed, a purgatory of beige walls and generic, soulless furniture where I watched the light move across the floor like a slow, silent sundial, measuring the passage of a time that no longer belonged to me, that had been stolen by a future I had financed with my very blood and bones but was no longer welcome to inhabit, a ghost in the machine of my own existence, a spectator at the funeral of my own dreams. The message that appeared on the screen, glowing with a malevolent, blue-white finality in the dim, lonely light of a late afternoon surrendering to evening, was from my son, Lysander. The name flashed, a brief, cruel, heartbreaking stab of normalcy in the gathering gloom, before the words beneath it, arranged with such brutal, surgical, emotionless economy, unraveled the very fabric of my world, pulling a single, crucial thread and watching, helpless, as the entire intricate, beautiful tapestry of my life came undone in an instant, the patterns of love and sacrifice dissolving into a meaningless tangle of broken threads. Lysander. The name itself is a story, a secret whispered between a young, hopeful, terrified mother and the future she dared to imagine, a future she painted in the most vibrant colors of her soul. I'd plucked it from a forgotten play I'd read in a dusty, sunlit library book as a pregnant, dreamy-eyed girl, a world and a lifetime away from the life of calloused hands and weary bones I would eventually lead, a girl who still believed in poetry and happy endings. It meant liberator. A name of hope, of tragedy, of complex, Shakespearean beauty. The child whose first cry I remembered as the most beautiful, complex symphony ever composed, a sound that rewired my soul, burning away the girl I had been and announcing a new, terrifying, and glorious purpose to my existence, a purpose that would become my entire universe, my sun and my moon, the central gravitational force around which all other aspects of my life would orbit, a force so strong it bent the very light of my being. The man whose ambitions I had financed not just with money, but with the very substance of my past, the quiet comforts of my present, and the promised security of my future, liquefying my entire history into capital for his dream, trading tangible, cherished memories for the intangible, fleeting currency of his potential. His message, though few in words, was a masterclass in emotional annihilation, a cold, corporate-style dismissal that laid bare a truth I had been willfully blinding myself to for years, a truth that had been whispering at the edges of our conversations for months, growing steadily louder, more insistent, until it could no longer be ignored, a truth that now stood before me, naked and undeniable in its cruelty. It read, "You are not invited to the launch. My partner thinks it is best." Those 10 words were not merely a rejection of my presence at a celebratory event, they were a nullification of my entire history, a formal decree that I, Odessa, had been officially categorized as extraneous, an awkward, embarrassing relic from a past that no longer fit the sleek, curated, sterile narrative of the success story my son and his partner, Vesper, were meticulously crafting for public consumption. I was a jarring, dissonant note in their harmonious composition, a splash of outdated, sentimental color on their minimalist, monochromatic canvas, and I was to be edited out, my presence redacted from the record of his triumph as if I were a state secret, a dangerous, inconvenient truth that threatened the integrity of their brand, the purity of their myth. My partner thinks it is best. The phrase echoed in the suddenly hollowed-out chambers of my heart, each syllable a precise, surgical hammer blow shattering the delicate, stained-glass window of maternal faith I had spent a lifetime constructing, pain by precious, painstaking, love-soaked pain. Each pain was a memory, his small, sticky, trusting hand in mine as we crossed busy streets, his complete, unquestioning faith a tangible weight that anchored me to the earth, the fierce, blazing pride in his eyes when he mastered a new word, the light of understanding dawning like a sunrise in his young face, a light I lived for, the trusting, heavy weight of his sleeping head on my shoulder, the soft, even puff of his breath against my neck, a feeling that was my definition of peace, the sound of his laughter, pure and unself-conscious, echoing through the small, shabby, love-filled rooms of our house, transforming them into a palace of joy, a fortress of love built not of stone and mortar, but of shared moments and unspoken understandings, a kingdom I was proud to serve. Now, it was all shattered, lying in 1,000 glittering, sharp, painful fragments at my feet, each one reflecting a different, beautiful, sacred moment of a love that had now been declared a liability, an impediment to progress, a sentimental attachment to be severed in the name of a colder, more efficient, more profitable future. This was the bitter, inexplicable, soul-destroying harvest of a $2 million investment that was not merely financial but existential, the final, devastating yield from a field I had tilled with my own youth, watered with my own sweat, and fertilized with my own deferred dreams, a crop of sorrow that now threatened to choke me, to pull me under into the rich, dark, suffocating soil of my own sacrifice. It was the sum total of 40 years of rising before the sun had even considered its own ascent, of hands perpetually raw, cracked, and stinging from a constant, brutal baptism in industrial cleaning solutions whose acrid scents of artificial lemon and ammonia had become the pervasive, unwelcome perfume of my sacrifice, a scent that seeped into my pores and became the base note of my identity, a smell I could never quite wash away, no matter how long I stood under the scalding, penitent spray of the shower, as if the evidence of my labor had become one with my very skin, a permanent tattoo of toil, a brand of servitude I wore for him. It was the ghost of a spine that ached with a persistent, throbbing testimony to the years spent bending over bathtubs, scrubbing toilets, and adjusting pillows for the frail, failing bodies of the elderly, souls like Mr. Henderson, who called me Clara, his long-dead wife, and Mrs. Davignon, who'd held my hand with a bird-like grip and whispered, "You are a good girl," their eyes, clouded with time and confusion, holding a mirror to my own deepest, unspoken fear of being alone and forgotten at the end, my own story erased as easily as a smudge on a windowpane, my own life reduced to a series of tasks performed for those who would not remember my name. This physical and emotional labor, this daily grind of dignity and despair, I had endured with a quiet, desperate stoicism because I believed, with every fiber of my being, that every drop of sweat, every pang of loneliness, every silent, private tear shed into a worn pillowcase in the deepest, most desolate hours of the night, was another brick, another beam, another foundational element laid in the magnificent, sprawling road that would lead my son to his glorious, deserved destiny. I was not building a road for myself, I was the road, and I believed the destination would justify the weight of the journey, the erosion of my own self, the slow, steady silencing of my own desires and dreams, a quiet death of the spirit that I accepted as the price of admission to his future success. That $2 million was the ghost of my mother's loving hands, the tangible weight of her wedding ring and her favorite pearl necklace, heirlooms I'd sold without a moment's hesitation to a brisk, impersonal man in a cramped, overlit shop that smelled of old metal and disappointment. The memories they held, the warmth of her skin, the light in her eyes when she wore them on special occasions, the stories they contained of love and commitment, liquefied into capital, converted into a sterile number in a bank account, a transaction that felt like a profound betrayal of her memory, a sin I committed in the name of a greater, more pressing love, a choice that haunted me in the quiet moments, the ghost of her disapproval a cold spot in my heart that never warmed. It was the accumulated equity of the only house I had ever owned, the sanctuary where I had built a life first with a man who vanished without a trace, and then alone with my son, a home whose every familiar creak in the floorboards, every smudge on a windowsill from a child's eager, nose-printed face watching for my return, was a sacred memory I had carefully, painfully packed away into anonymous cardboard boxes that now sat in a dusty, expensive storage unit, museum of a life I had voluntarily ended, a history I had boxed up and stored away in the name of a shared future that was now being denied to me. I consciously traded a world of cherished, tactile history for a small, temporary, and soul-crushingly generic rental apartment that smelled of other people's lives and industrial cleaner, all while repeating the mantra to myself, a desperate, fervent incantation against the rising tide of doubt, that this was merely a stepping stone, a prudent, necessary sacrifice for our shared, brilliant future. I was betting on us, and I bet everything, my past, my present, my future, on a single, terrifying hand of cards, convinced that the house, my son's heart, could not possibly lose, that the loyalty I had sown with every selfless act would be the loyalty I reaped in my autumn years. And now, just 6 short, cataclysmic months after handing him that check, a slip of paper that represented the complete and total liquidation of my past and the deliberate, terrifying mortgaging of my future, I was being told by my own child, the sole beneficiary of this ultimate, staggering act of faith, that my presence was undesirable, that I was an encumbrance, a social liability, on the very threshold of the dream I had poured my entire life into making possible. The pain was not a sharp, clean cut that could be stitched and healed, it was a slow, crushing, suffocating weight, a geological pressure, like being buried alive in the cold, heavy, unforgiving soil of my own mounting irrelevance, the weight of every no I'd ever said to myself now collapsing in on me, entombing me in the dark, silent grave of his indifference. As I sat there, the phone slipping from my numb, unfeeling fingers to land with a dull, final, funereal thud on the cheap synthetic rug, I was violently transported back through the decades, a helpless ghost forced to haunt the desolate, heart-rending museum of my own sacrifices, each exhibit a monument to a love that had now been declared obsolete, each memory a knife twisting in the wound of this fresh, incomprehensible betrayal, a pain so total, so absolute, it felt like the end of the world. Because in a way, it was. The world I had built, the universe I had inhabited, had its center of gravity in him, and without that pull, I was cast into the void, a planet untethered from its sun, spinning into the cold, dark emptiness of space. The memories did not come as a gentle stream, but as a raging, torrential, unforgiving flood, pulling me under, drowning me in the vivid, painful, technicolor details of a life lived entirely for someone else, a life where my own identity had been willingly, lovingly, joyfully subsumed into the greater cause of his well-being. I saw myself as a young, terrified widow in everything but the legal paperwork, holding my bewildered, father-hungry 5-year-old son in the aching, profound silence that followed his father Enoch's departure, a man who vanished like morning mist, leaving behind not a note, not a reason, but only a void of profound confusion and an ever-growing, suffocating mountain of daunting bills that arrived in the mailbox with terrifying regularity, each envelope a fresh wave of panic, a tide of numbers I feared would drown us both, pulling us under into a poverty from which I knew we might never surface. My own consuming grief was a luxury I could not afford, a garment too fine to wear while scrubbing other people's floors, so I folded it neatly and stored it in a locked chest deep inside me, where it gathered its own silent, potent dust, a sediment of sorrow at the bottom of my soul that I promised myself I would one day examine, a promise that remained unfulfilled for decades, the key to that chest lost in the daily, grinding struggle to survive. The memories did not come as a gentle stream, but as a raging, torrential, unforgiving flood, pulling me under, drowning me in the vivid, painful, technicolor details of a life lived entirely for someone else, a life where my own identity had been willingly, lovingly, joyfully subsumed into the greater cause of his well-being. I saw myself as a young, terrified widow in everything but the legal paperwork, holding my bewildered, father-hungry 5-year-old son in the aching, profound silence that followed his father Enoch's departure, a man who vanished like morning mist, leaving behind not a note, not a reason, but only a void of profound confusion and an ever-growing, suffocating mountain of daunting bills that arrived in the mailbox with terrifying regularity, each envelope a fresh wave of panic, a tide of numbers I feared would drown us both, pulling us under into a poverty from which I knew we might never surface. My own consuming grief was a luxury I could not afford, a garment too fine to wear while scrubbing other people's floors, so I folded it neatly and stored it in a locked chest deep inside me, where it gathered its own silent, potent dust, a sediment of sorrow at the bottom of my soul that I promised myself I would one day examine, a promise that remained unfulfilled for decades, the key to that chest lost in the daily, grinding struggle to survive. Nightly, I answered my son's plaintive, heartbreaking question, "Mama, where did Daddy go? Is he coming back?" with a brave face and a heart that felt like it had been pulverized into shattered glass, building a fortress of sheer, unyielding will around our tiny, vulnerable, shattered family, a fortress with only one soldier standing guard on the walls, a soldier who was also the cook, the cleaner, the comforter, the provider, the sole architect of our fragile world, a burden I carried not with resentment, but with a ferocious, desperate love that was my only source of strength, the only fuel for my weary engine. I felt anew the bone-deep, soul-consuming exhaustion of working a double shift, of leaving a sleeping Lysander with a weary but kind-hearted neighbor, Mrs. Gable, whose own eyes held a similar story of quiet struggle and resigned fortitude, so I could spend the witching hours mopping the vast, empty, eerily silent corridors of downtown office buildings, my reflection a pale, distorted ghost in the dark windows of corporate power, a phantom in a world of sleeping ambition, my own dreams deferred, so that his might one day take flight. The unnatural, tomb-like hush of those corporate spaces, punctuated only by the whirring of the polisher and the distant, lonely echo of a security guard's footsteps, was a stark, chilling contrast to the frantic, fearful beating of my own heart, which was always, always with him, in that small room miles away, listening for a cry that would never come because he was a good boy. He always slept through the night, a small, profound mercy for which I was perpetually, guiltily grateful, a reprieve that allowed me to earn the money to keep a roof over his head, to build the road for his future, one polished, gleaming, anonymous floor at a time. I remembered the fierce, burning, almost painful pride that swelled within me, a pride so intense it brought hot, sudden tears to my eyes, when he was accepted into a prestigious, intimidating private university, a world of manicured quads and soaring, Gothic architecture and soaring intellectual ambition so far removed from our own humble, hardscrabble reality. It felt like he had been accepted into a different galaxy, a place I could observe only through the photographs he sent and the stories he told, a distant, shining star I had helped him reach through a lifetime of labor and love. That pride was instantly shadowed by the simultaneous, ice-cold dread that gripped me, a dread that lived in the pit of my stomach like a shard of ice, when the first tuition bill arrived, a thick, expensive, authoritative envelope that felt like a verdict, a confirmation that we were trespassers in this world of privilege, and the cost of admission was everything I had, every sacrifice I had yet to make, a price tag on a future I could barely afford but was determined to provide, even if it meant selling the very clothes off my back. A dread I forcefully silenced by securing a second job on weekends, cleaning the sprawling, immaculate, and often soulless homes in the affluent suburb of Buckhead, homes that were monuments to a success I could only clean up after, their opulence a silent, judgmental gaze on my own modest life, a constant, piercing reminder of the chasm between the world he was entering and the world I inhabited, a chasm I was determined to bridge with my own broken body. My knees ground in protest as I scrubbed the pristine, imported marble floors of strangers, my hands bleeding from scouring their expensive, polished fixtures, all while clinging, like a lifeline, to the mental image of my son's radiant, triumphant face on his graduation day, an image I polished and refined until it shone like a holy icon in the private chapel of my mind, a grail that would sanctify all this drudgery, that would make the ache in my bones and the numbness in my heart a worthy offering, a sacred sacrifice on the altar of his potential. You can study wherever your heart desires, son, I had told him, my voice a fortress of certainty belying the terrifying, seismic tremor in my soul, a tremor of fear that I would not be enough, that my love and my labor would not be sufficient to bridge the gap between his birth and his destiny. I will handle the rest. It was a promise that felt like a vow, a sacred oath whispered not just to him, but to the universe itself, and I was a woman who kept her vows, even when they cost her everything, even when the price was her own becoming, the slow, steady, inexorable erosion of the woman named Odessa into the archetype of Mama, a transformation I underwent willingly, seeing it not as a loss, but as the highest, purest form of love. And I did. I handled it. Through years of his underemployment and professional uncertainty, the slow, discouraging, soul-testing grind of a gifted mind searching for its place in an indifferent world that didn't yet recognize his spark, that didn't see the brilliance I knew was there, burning with a fierce, quiet intensity, I was his anchor. I quietly supplemented his meager income, transferring funds with a silent prayer that this would be the last time, that his ship would finally come in, that the world would see in him what I had always seen, tirelessly paid for his specialized, career-advancing courses, became his unwavering, silent partner long before there was a company called Luminous Tech or a formal business plan, my belief in him the one constant, unwavering beacon in a world that often seemed determined to tell him no. A world I had spent a lifetime buffeting against on his behalf, a human shield against disappointment, a silent engine of his ambition, the wind beneath wings that had not yet learned they could fly. When he finally came to me, his eyes alight with that specific, incandescent fire I knew and loved so well, the fire that had once been directed at Lego castles and science fair projects, with a revolutionary idea that needed initial capital, and he whispered that terrifying, monumental number, 2 million. The silence that followed in my small, modest living room was not one of hesitation or doubt, but of a profound, life-altering commitment, a silent vow exchanged between a mother's heart and her child's future, a pact written in the air between us, a covenant signed in blood and hope and 4 decades of shared history. I saw the number not as a simple quantity of money, but as a physical, overwhelming representation of every no I had ever said to myself, no to a new winter coat, no to a weekend vacation, no to a simple, cheerful restaurant meal, no to the quiet, secure retirement I had only occasionally, and timidly, dared to imagine in the quiet moments before sleep claimed me. I saw in that number all the deferred joys, the swallowed pride, the countless small relinquishments that constituted the hidden, sacred ledger of my love, a balance sheet where my debits were his credits, where my losses were his gains, where my silence was the fertile ground for his voice. And I looked at my son, at the pure, unadulterated passion that animated his every feature, and I said the words that would ultimately unravel and then, miraculously, redefine my entire life, all right, son. Count on me. His joy was my immediate, intoxicating reward, a fleeting, beautiful currency that felt, in that suspended, perfect moment, like it could fill the vault of any sacrifice, no matter how great, a radiant heat that could melt the ice of any deferred dream, a light so bright it blinded me to the precipice on which I was standing. He hugged me, lifting my weary, 60-year-old body off the floor with an effortless strength that startled me, a reminder of the man he had become, spinning me around in a giddy circle as he had when he was a small, laughing boy, his promises falling from his lips like sacred, unbreakable vows. You are the best mother in the world, Mama. I promise you this is going to work. I promise I am going to pay back every penny with interest. I promise I am never going to forget what you are doing for me. The memory of those promises now felt like the cruelest, most sophisticated of jokes, their hollow echoes bouncing mockingly off the sterile, beige walls of my silent apartment, taunting the profound, beautiful naivete of the woman who had believed them with such absolute, foolish faith, a faith that was my greatest strength and, it turned out, my most profound vulnerability, the chink in my armor through which the fatal blow was struck, a wound so deep it would take years to scar over, a pain that would become the raw, primal material for my rebirth. The golden, idyllic era that followed the investment was brief but utterly intoxicating, a 6-month period that glows in my memory like fool's gold, glittering and precious in the moment, but ultimately worthless, a beautiful, shimmering facade that concealed the structural flaws already eating away at its foundation. He called me daily, his voice buzzing with unrestrained excitement, flooding my phone with photos of the new, sleek offices with their exposed brick and modern art, enthusiastically introducing me to early employees via joyful, chaotic video calls where I'd wave from my little screen, feeling like a queen observing her court, consistently using the word our company, our project, our vision. And I, like a thirsty traveler who has finally found an oasis in a desert after years of wandering, drank the potent, life-giving potion of inclusion, believing with my whole, grateful heart that I was not just the financier but a fundamental, integral, living part of the dream itself. The dream had a heartbeat, and it synced with mine. Its breath was my breath, its future was my future. I was, for those few precious months, not just the foundation, but part of the soaring architecture, a pillar in the temple of his ambition, my name etched into its cornerstone, or so I believed. But then, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, like the first, nearly invisible crack in a frozen lake that presages a catastrophic break, the atmosphere began to shift, the emotional climate changing with the arrival of a new, powerful, and controlling weather system named Vesper. Initially, she was just a name in his enthusiastic stories, a brilliant, savvy marketing specialist he'd met at a networking event, but she quickly evolved into a constant, pervasive, and eventually ominous refrain in the soundtrack of our conversations, a dissonant chord that grew louder and more dominant with each passing week, drowning out the melody of our old connection, the familiar harmony of our bond, until their duet became a trio where I was the silent, unwelcome guest. Vesper says we should pivot our strategy to capture a more affluent demographic. Vesper has incredible connections in the venture capital world. Vesper believes we need to be more aggressive in our projections to attract series of funding. Her presence was a slow, insidious frost, creeping with patient malice into the warm, familiar, lovingly tended garden of my relationship with my son, wilting the delicate, beautiful flowers of our connection one by one, the shared jokes that became less frequent, the easy confidences that were replaced by vague generalities, the unshakable certainty of our bond that began to feel conditional, contingent upon my compliance, my willingness to recede into the background, until the landscape I had known and nurtured for a lifetime began to look foreign, alien, and barren, a place I no longer recognized, a country from which I was being systematically exiled, my citizenship revoked without due process. The first time I saw her, on a grainy, lagging video call that pixelated her face into a series of abstract squares before resolving into sharp, unsettling focus, she was a vision of impeccable, intimidating corporate polish, sleek, expensively styled hair that fell like a sheet of obsidian, an impeccably tailored, stark white blouse that seemed to radiate a sterile authority, an aura of unassailable, cold competence that seemed to permeate through the digital screen and into my humble living room, making my own worn armchair and faded family photograph seem suddenly shabby and quaint, artifacts from a less evolved time, relics of a past that was no longer relevant, a history that had been deemed obsolete. Vesper, this is my mom, Odessa, Lysander had said, his voice still warm with a familial pride that, in retrospect, felt like an artifact from a lost civilization, a sentiment that had not yet been streamlined out of him by her influence. Her response, a pleasure, Mrs. Odessa, was delivered with a smile that was a perfect, vacant, professionally calibrated mask, not a single genuine watt of its energy reaching her cold, calculating, assessing eyes, which scanned me, my surroundings, and found us both wanting, categorizing us in an instant as part of a history that needed to be overcome, a narrative to be superseded, a problem to be managed, a variable to be controlled. When I tried to engage, to ask a thoughtful question about their long-term growth strategy and brand identity, hoping to connect on a level beyond the maternal, to show I was more than just the source of funds, she dismissed me with a tone of condescending, impatient patience, turning immediately and exclusively back to Lysander to discuss the Q3 numbers for the upcoming investor call, and he, my brave, beautiful boy, my son, said nothing. He did not champion me. He did not pull me into the conversation. He did not affirm my place or my right to ask. He simply allowed the dismissal to happen, a passive bystander in the slow, deliberate erosion of my role, and in that moment, I felt the first, hairline fracture, no wider than a silk thread, appear in the solid bedrock of our world, a fissure that would, in time, widen into a catastrophic, soul-swallowing chasm, separating us into two different continents, staring at each other across an uncrossable sea of silence and betrayal, the distance between us growing with every unspoken word, every missed opportunity to defend what we had been. The descent from that point was a gradual, excruciating, heartbreaking slide into invisibility, a demotion from protagonist to footnote in the story of my own life, a slow fade to black while the spotlight shifted to a new, shinier cast. Our Sunday dinners, a sacred, unwavering tradition for over 20 years, a weekly sacrament of our bond involving my famous pot roast and his eager, detailed retelling of the week's events, were the first cherished ritual to be sacrificed on the altar of Vesper's ambition, cancelled with a series of increasingly flimsy, transparent excuses that always, inevitably, circled back to the demands of Vesper's schedule. Vesper has organized a mandatory, all-hands strategy session for Sunday. It's the only time the whole team can sync. The daily, life-giving calls became weekly, then sporadic, their content shifting dramatically from shared excitement and vulnerability to vague, formal, carefully sanitized updates that felt like corporate press releases, devoid of the human messiness, the stumbles and recoveries, the very texture of life that I craved, the proof that he was still my son, a flesh and blood man and not just a corporate entity. When I asked for details, for the human story behind the business, for the struggles and triumphs of the people I had begun to think of as extended family, he began to parrot her cold, corporate phrases about maintaining professional boundaries and the importance of cleanly separating family from business, as if my boundless love and my monumental financial investment were a toxic, volatile mixture that threatened the very structural integrity of their enterprise. I was being professionally managed out of my own son's life, my presence treated as a conflict of interest in the business of his heart, an emotional liability to be hedged against, a risk to be mitigated. Desperate to bridge the growing, terrifying chasm, to feel the solid ground of my son's love beneath my feet once more, to remind him of who we were before the gloss and the polish, I committed what was, in their new, ruthless world order, the ultimate sin. I visited the office unannounced, a foolish, hopeful, deeply maternal gesture straight from the playbook of the woman I used to be. The woman who believed that love could solve any problem if you just showed up with enough of it, embodied. And real, a force of nature that could not be denied, a truth that could not be negotiated. I wore my best emerald green dress, the one he'd once said brought out the light in my eyes, and I brought a box of still warm sweet potato turnovers from his favorite childhood bakery, the one across town I'd had to drive 40 minutes to reach, the scent of cinnamon and butter and childhood memory filling my car. A smell that was the very essence of US, of home, of a shared history that predated spreadsheets and venture capital, a history I believed was unassailable. I was met not by my son, but by Vesper, her demeanor that of a prison warden confronting an escaped inmate she had long been expecting and was prepared to neutralize with efficient, dispassionate force. "Mrs. Odessa." "What a surprise," she said, her voice a finely honed weapon of chilled steel, each word dipped in frost. Her eyes doing a quick, dismissive inventory of my dress, the pastry box, my very being, assessing my threat level and finding it negligible, a minor nuisance to be dealt with swiftly. I explained my simple, heartfelt mission, holding up the pastry box like a shield, a peace offering from a world of warmth and memory she clearly despised and sought to systematically eradicate, a world she viewed as sentimental clutter, an impediment to progress, an anchor dragging down the ship of their ambition. "How thoughtful," she replied, her smile never wavering, never touching the flat, assessing coldness of her eyes, which were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, promising a deluge. "But Lysander is in a critical, closed-door meeting with potential investors from Singapore. He cannot be interrupted. It would be best if you coordinated your visits in advance through me." Coordinated my visits, I was being managed. I was a logistical problem, an item on an agenda to be scheduled or, preferably, avoided entirely. And from the depths of the office, from behind a closed door of frosted glass, my son, who must have heard the familiar, unmistakable sound of my voice, a sound that had called him home for dinner, soothed fevers, and cheered at graduations, did not emerge. He left me standing there in that sleek, cold, minimalist lobby, being systematically, politely, and utterly dismantled by his partner. And the silence from his office, a silence I knew in my bones meant he could hear every humiliating word, was a louder, more devastating betrayal than any shouted insult or slammed door could ever be. It was a betrayal of complicity, of cowardice, and it stole the air from my lungs, leaving me hollow and gasping in that beautiful, terrible room, a ghost in the machine of his new life, a phantom pain where a son used to be. "What a surprise," she said, her voice a finely honed weapon of chilled steel, each word dipped in frost, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive inventory of my dress, the pastry box, my very being, assessing my threat level and finding it negligible, a minor nuisance to be dealt with swiftly. I explained my simple, heartfelt mission, holding up the pastry box like a shield, a peace offering from a world of warmth and memory she clearly despised and sought to systematically eradicate, a world she viewed as sentimental clutter, an impediment to progress, an anchor dragging down the ship of their ambition. "How thoughtful," she replied, her smile never wavering, never touching the flat, assessing coldness of her eyes, which were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, promising a deluge. "But Lysander is in a critical, closed-door meeting with potential investors from Singapore. He cannot be interrupted. It would be best if you coordinated your visits in advance through me." Coordinated my visits, I was being managed. I was a logistical problem, an item on an agenda to be scheduled or, preferably, avoided entirely. And from the depths of the office, from behind a closed door of frosted glass, my son, who must have heard the familiar, unmistakable sound of my voice, a sound that had called him home for dinner, soothed fevers, and cheered at graduations, did not emerge. He left me standing there in that sleek, cold, minimalist lobby, being systematically, politely, and utterly dismantled by his partner, and the silence from his office, a silence I knew in my bones meant he could hear every humiliating word, was a louder, more devastating betrayal than any shouted insult or slammed door could ever be. It was a betrayal of complicity, of cowardice, and it stole the air from my lungs, leaving me hollow and gasping in that beautiful, terrible room, a ghost in the machine of his new life, a phantom pain where a son used to be. The word landed like a physical blow to the chest, a sucker punch that knocked the air from my lungs and left me gasping, bent over the kitchen counter as if I'd been struck, the world swimming in a nauseating swirl of disbelief and agony. My love, my sacrifice, my very being, was a contaminant, a complication to be managed and sequestered, a hazardous waste spill in the clean room of his ambition, something to be contained and disposed of, a relic of a less efficient, more sentimental time. "I want to be treated like your mother, not a bank," I pleaded, my voice breaking, the last vestiges of my pride crumbling into dust, leaving me raw and exposed, a beggar at the table I had set, a supplicant pleading for a scrap of the love I had once taken for granted, a love that now felt like a distant country I had been exiled from. "Then stop acting like a creditor and act like a mother," he shot back, his words a whip crack of finality, and the sharp, definitive click of him hanging up was the sound of a final door slamming shut, locking me out forever in the bitter, howling cold of his new, Vesper-curated life. The dial tone was a mockery, a flat line where a heartbeat, where a conversation, where a relationship used to be, the endless buzz of my own sudden, absolute irrelevance, the sound of a connection severed with surgical precision. The weeks of silence that followed were a barren, desolate, emotionally frozen landscape, an arctic tundra of the spirit where no light seemed to penetrate and no warmth could survive. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the small, impersonal apartment that had become the tomb of my sacrifices, watching his success unfold through the curated, glittering lens of social media, a spectacular, glamorous show from which I had been permanently, deliberately, and publicly exiled. The launch party I was not invited to was a lavish, star-studded affair, photographed and splashed across every relevant industry blog. I saw the pictures, my son, handsome and beaming, his arm wrapped possessively around Vesper's waist, her smile a triumph of conquest, a look of pure, unadulterated ownership. I was not in a single photo. I was not even a footnote. I had been disappeared, my role in his narrative reduced to a silent, anonymous asterisk, a forgotten contributor in the fine print of his life, a memory he had chosen to discard. But then, from the absolute zero of that despair, from the core of that ice, a new energy began to coalesce, a slow, stubborn, defiant heat building from a part of me I had forgotten existed, a part that was not Lysander's mother, but simply and powerfully, Odessa. The grief did not disappear, it underwent a fierce, alchemical transformation, hardening from a liquid state of helpless sorrow into a solid, unbreakable, diamond-hard substance, resolve. I was not a victim. I was a businesswoman who had made a poor emotional investment in a person, but the legal and financial terms of that investment were still binding, still held power, still had teeth. I had been playing a losing hand in the game of the heart, but there was another game being played, one with rules and contracts and balance sheets, and it was time I started playing it, and playing to win. I called my old friend Odora, the steadfast, sharp-eyed banker who had personally witnessed and processed the transfer of my entire life savings, who had clicked her tongue in disapproval but had respected my decision, a woman who understood numbers better than she understood people, which in this moment, was exactly what I needed. She came over that very evening, and together, surrounded by the detritus of my grief, take-out containers and cold cups of tea, and the soft, focused glow of a single desk lamp that carved a pool of light and sanity out of the surrounding darkness, we pored over the dense, legalistic documents I had signed in a state of blind, loving faith. And there it was, in stark, unassailable black and white, buried in clauses and sub-clauses that my tear-blurred eyes had once skimmed over in my rush to enable his dream. My $2 million had purchased a 60% equity stake in Luminous Tech, LLC. I was not a silent investor, I was the majority shareholder. I held the controlling interest. I held the power. I had simply been too busy, too heartbroken, playing the role of the wounded, pleading mother to remember I was also, legally and financially, the chairman of the board. The shock of that discovery was like a defibrillator to my soul. A jolt. A restart. The ghost of Odessa sat up, took a deep, shuddering breath, and remembered her own name, her own power, her own rightful place at the head of the table. The next day, I called Lysander. But the voice that came out of my mouth was not the trembling, pleading, emotionally shattered voice of his mother. It was the calm, firm, unyielding, and terrifyingly quiet voice of Odessa, the primary stakeholder. Lysander, schedule an urgent board meeting for tomorrow at 10 a.m. I will be reviewing the last quarter's financials and discussing several material breaches of our operating agreement. And ensure that Vesper is present. The silence on his end of the line was profound, a void of stunned confusion. I did not wait for a reply. I did not soothe. I did not explain. I hung up. The sound of the receiver settling into its cradle was the first, clear, resonant note of a new symphony I was about to compose, a composition of reclamation and dignity, a melody of power reclaimed from the ashes of a love betrayed.